Hola a todos, esto es Abra, Tecnologías Emergentes, donde buscamos conversar sobre tecnologías, data y soluciones digitales que están moldeando la transformación de empresas e impactando a miles de personas dentro de esta industria 4.0. Justamente abrimos este espacio para ayudar a compañías, a personas, a equipos como ustedes que están creando el futuro del trabajo y moldeando a las organizaciones del futuro en Latinoamérica. Hoy tenemos un invitado fantástico. Tenemos el honor de contar con 𝐂𝐿, quien trabaja en Notion, liderando todo el frente latinoamericano. Previamente ha trabajado para Fulbright en la oficina de la Casa Blanca, en temas de políticas domésticas, y es un apasionado por temas de productividad, colaboración, cómo ayudar a organizaciones a comunicarse mejor. Y qué mejor que hablar de este frente también directamente desde Notion. Se nos suma para contarnos toda la historia sobre gestión de conocimiento, algunos datos y cómo viene la tecnología en este entorno. Bienvenido, 𝐂𝐿. Welcome, 𝐂𝐿, to the show.
Gracias, Sebastian. Es un placer estar aquí. Obviously, a pleasure to be here. I'm joining from New York City in the U.S.
Incredible. So tell us a little bit about you, like what do you do right now in Notion? I know you're really focused in the Latin American region.
Yeah, so I'm super passionate about working with LATAM, all the way from the northern areas of Mexico to the far south of Chile and Argentina and everywhere in between. So right now we are approaching, so we have a very passionate and viral base of users and a community in LATAM who are using Notion and have used Notion for years. And so our idea is to obviously expand that base of users, especially as we go up market and work with more companies. And I'm excited to talk with you today about how knowledge management works in large companies as well as small companies. So I'm really trying to figure out some of those hard questions about how to sell a product in LATAM, the best strategy to make sure your product is fit for business in LATAM. And so, yeah, happy to talk about these and more subjects, I'm sure, today.
Yeah, amazing. It's that mixture of culture and the tools that we have to manage knowledge. So let's start with something like basic. So what does knowledge management mean for organizations?
Yeah, so there's a dictionary definition for this that we think, but I also think there's something a lot more powerful and transformative about knowledge management. So I think about the dictionary definition as knowledge management is the documentation and the standardization of processes that your company might have, but values that your company has, and then the strategy that you have, whether it's a goal to grow as a company or take over the whole region of LATAM as as the top company in your industry. So that's kind of the dictionary definition I think of. But really, I think knowledge management is democratizing information and the sharing of information within a company or an organization, or even as small as a team or a project. So democratizing information and making everyone more connected to the mission and the values that I mentioned earlier, and those processes, of course. And so we improve visibility with knowledge management within companies.
That sounds really great. I mean, and understanding from different perspectives is so different for a small company or a small team than large organizations with 5,000, 10,000 people. And right now, as we turn into a more like agile way of working, the visibility, the transparency, it's so relevant for the teams to move forward, to have more productivity, to have more information available to decide on what they're going to build, and that in different divisions of any company. So the second question that I have for you is how to start turning company data into valuable company knowledge assets.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I guess before the question, I would love to know, I mean, do you have a sense for our audience today? I mean, is it all across the board? Do we have folks that are entrepreneurs and startups? Is it more of an audience that's part of these large organizations? Do you have a sense for like who we're speaking to?
Exactly. Yeah. Many people that join us today and in the future that is going to watch this video are from large organizations. Yeah. So people that work in organizations from 2,000 people and more. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're sitting on a ton of data, processes that have been, especially in some of these large legacy companies that have been around for sometimes 100 years or more. So, in terms of your question, so turning company data into knowledge assets, I think just from a strategy perspective, it really helps to have organizational champions and folks that are directly responsible individuals for creating some sort of structure. So like one thing we find at Notion, and I can talk about this later, is that, it's a very grassroots product. And so you get people that use it for their personal life or they use it for work projects. And grassroots is really great for growing a product virally very quickly. But as you get into a large organization, it's really important to have a structure for how knowledge is being created and then shared internally within the organization. I think it also helps a lot to have tools that integrate with each other. So, for example, you have all these tools that you probably use within your company and organization, and you're constantly switching context from tool to tool to tool to tool in your workflow. And I think having tools that connect with each other, whether it's within the same suite of products, like a Microsoft 365 or Atlassian or Google, is great. But there's been an increasing emphasis on tools that aren't within the same suite that are integrating with each other. So Notion, for example, integrates with Figma and Jira and several other tools. And so I think thinking about your tool stack and whether it connects with each other and using those synergies can help a lot as well.
Interesting. Yeah, because what I see, from my perspective, is that Notion started with early adopters from startups or design teams, people that were more advanced in technology, so smaller teams. And I believe those teams, tech teams, are sharing that information with other divisions of companies and sharing also the culture of documentation. So that's why I made you that question. And because as the information and data from companies grows, it's harder to manage that information, to find what you're looking for, and also to handle different types of documents, files. So it gets like a bigger challenge for bigger organizations, right?
Absolutely. Like the challenge at scale, especially in larger, older legacy companies, if you have a company that started in the digital age, this is like one of the foremost problems that an engineering team or a product team is thinking about. We're documenting the product as we build it. Exactly. And, you take a company that's been around for 50, 60, 100 years, maybe in retail or textiles, whatever it might be. And the documentation and the knowledge is very different, and it may not be so digital. So, thinking about how we're digitizing those processes, making informal processes something that we feel comfortable putting into a Notion document or a Google Doc or Confluence, whatever it is, and putting our stamp of approval on that is a very interesting problem for larger companies.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a main difference that they have with like the startup culture and large organizations, that you have live documents that keep like maturing in time, and they keep changing. As in large organizations, they kind of setting like the file that is restricted to that, and it's not going to change in the next 2 years, for example. So I wanted to know a little bit about what are your thoughts or recommendations on developing this culture of documentation and sharing.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on the size of your company and the culture and some of those things that we talked about earlier, if we're starting from scratch, whether it's a small company or a large organization where knowledge sharing feels very fragmented, while I think it is important to start thinking from the bottom up in sort of the types of tools that you're procuring to document, a knowledge base, for example, it really does. And we find the best traction with Notion, having a group of champions that are passionate about processes and organization. I'm a person that's very, very type A. I'm very process oriented, and I'm also very motivated to help my colleagues achieve more, be more productive, be more efficient. And so I'd be the exact type of person you'd want to tap in, on a like a board of champions that is either searching for a new tool or figuring out the knowledge management structure, because it's really high leverage work at any company, is to literally think about how we are sharing information with each other. And I think the other thing to recognize, like one of the hidden benefits of a better knowledge management strategy, is there's a lot of turnover in this market. We can talk a little bit about some of the macroeconomic factors that are going on right now, but there's going to be a lot of turnover. And at larger organizations where you have people, maybe a small group of people that's responsible for creating that content, if someone leaves, who's owning that content is a big question that we have. So we want to think a lot about how we have redundancy and structures for knowledge management. Mm-hmm. And then I think also having, it needs to be a foundational drive from leadership that transparency is important for the company. Because I think a byproduct of transparency is having good documentation. It's having and emphasizing collaboration and cross-functional work and sharing with each other best practices. And so I think if transparency isn't a value at the top of that's kind of driving any of this, it's going to be very hard to get the type of traction you'd want for a knowledge management tool or system to be implemented and to be implemented effectively. Like if you have a siloed department that there's no drive to connect that department elsewhere, it's going to be really hard for us to feel like a transparent organization and get their knowledge into our knowledge base.
Yeah, interesting. And one related question that I had is if right now Notion is mostly used by tech teams, design teams, instead of, for example, a marketing team or an operations or a legal team. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So as you mentioned, I think you hit the nail on the head earlier with Notion's kind of foot in the door at a lot of these companies, big and small, has been from one of two places. So the one place is we have a design team, a head of engineering, or a chief product officer that uses Notion and says, okay, this is my favorite product in the world. We're going to bring this to the company and we're going to deploy it across the team. And you see, especially within a product organization, that if a design team brings it in, it spreads pretty quickly to engineering and product, for example, or even data science. But then you have these very tech savvy kind of digital first users who the structure of Notion makes a lot of sense to. So we find that they adopt Notion pretty quickly. It grows quickly within a product organization. But you'd be really surprised that kind of the second group of people that are the champions of Notion are actually founders themselves. Now, this applies specifically to startups, but some of these startups have grown to be quite large. And I know, just given the Continuum connection, you have some experience with Notion. And so, we could chat offline about any feedback you have for us and our strategy, of course. But we'll have, kind of a top-down say, okay, knowledge management, not just in documentation of our product, but also in everything we do as a company is super important to us. We've seen growth with Notion that way as well. So we have tons of marketing teams. And I think one other piece of advice I have for folks just in the economy right now is with tooling, finding tools that can do more than one thing. And so a lot of people will say, approach me and say, we want to use Notion for project management within our business intelligence team, for example. And I say, that's great, but in addition to that, here are all these other use cases that companies are using Notion for: documentation, wikis, meeting notes, OKRs, KPIs, all these different use cases. And here's all we can do. And they say, oh my gosh, I had no idea that Notion could do so many things. So yeah, it's been product teams, very tech first, a foot in the door there, or it's been founders kind of coming and saying, let's go top down with this.
Yeah. And that's what I wanted to go a little bit deep. I mean, I know like you provide the tool, like of course Notion, and we love that at Continuum. But what about the other part? I mean, someone has to learn how to use Notion, because at the beginning Notion was like really simple. You can do like one or two things really easy, yeah. But right now you have like many features and options. So is there any like involvement in the culture of documentation on how do you like a playbook, for example, that you can share with companies that are traditional and big and they want to like step up in their knowledge management? Because I'm thinking right now about the clients that we handle. Like we have like really, really big companies like banks, traditional like companies, and they might have a knowledge management division. Yeah. But they do like many things, and they use, of course, like more traditional software and tools and practices. So in our case, when we started using Notion at Continuum, it was really easier for us to use it and scale it. And now we have like a lot of documentation. So is there something that you recommend on creating this culture of documentation? Is there a playbook that you can share with us, or best practices?
I would love to solicit the community advice here in terms of, and not today, obviously we're having this conversation one-on-one, but that is like a primary project and concern for us right now, because the reality is for any product-led growth company like Notion, and there are many out there, even as you become a household name for a personal use case or a team use case, small business, the focus is, of course, to be able to support really high leverage deployments at mid-market and enterprise sized companies with thousands and thousands of employees. And change management is like, and change management strategy, if Notion is a completely new tool to a company, or even if we support 1,000 users in product and now we're going organization wide to 10,000 users. That is a playbook that is very much still something we're developing. We have a customer success team that is working in some of our larger deployments, especially to even figure out how Notion got to be as big as it did within a company with, say, 3,000 users. We don't necessarily have the clearest idea of how that came to be. We know it spreads from one team to another, but they're not checking in every time they add a new team and saying, hey, Notion, we added our marketing team. And so we're trying to build stronger connections between these groups of champions at these companies that are very passionate about Notion and evangelizing Notion within their company. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to make this a discussion topic within the community in terms of change management, best practices, and a playbook for knowledge management.
Amazing. Thank you for that. So the other question that I had is like, of course, you are involved in the product development, you have been involved in knowledge management, how to use data. So thinking that we're in 2023 right now almost. So what goes beyond documentation and knowledge management? Like, and how can companies like make the most out of their data?
Yeah. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Because I want to dig in, and I think this is a really interesting question just about where we are right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, as you said previously, like many companies have like tons and tons and tons of data and information, but they don't know how to use it. And that is a challenge for, like, of course, every organization right now. It's like, it's money that they have. I mean, information is money that they have, and they're not using it because, like, it's still maturing right now how information is handled in the company. And as like analytics grow, they get more mature for companies. I believe this connection of data, documentation, qualitative data and quantitative data, I think there can be a step up right now. And what are you seeing right now in the future? I mean, how does that information is going to be handled in the future? How can we make the most out of that?
Yeah. This is like a very salient topic for right now. I think, as again, you're sitting on so much data, most, hopefully of which can be tracked, and you have tools to track, I just think I've gotten more and more requests. For example, we have integrations with 𝐓𝐄𝐂𝐍𝐻𝐋 and with Amplitude, which are two, just product-based, data reporting tools. And so it's very much the direction of where we're taking our product. So like, I think, and this is anecdotal, okay, so I may be totally speaking out of pocket here, but like one thing I've seen is that it can be very hard. So you brought this up earlier and you said, like tools like Notion or even Figma, some of these tools are very much geared towards very technical users.
Exactly.
And I think a lot about democratizing access to information and also helping people interpret what is actually being said by the data is very much a focus, of some of these products like Amplitude and like 𝐓𝐿𝐻𝐋 and Mixpanel and, what have you, that will give you user data as they interact with your product or your website, et cetera. But I think there's going to be an increased emphasis on like unlocking the insights within that data and then sharing them to a more broad audience, because I find, even sometimes I have great colleagues that I work with in data science who are incredibly smart people answering incredibly high leverage questions for the business. And they have a super rich data set that they're sitting on. And then I'm like, I have no idea in the go-to-market team necessarily what's driving some of these decisions. And so I think what goes beyond is better integrations between potentially a knowledge management system and your data warehousing, and some of these tools to synthesize and analyze that data, be them a 𝐓𝐻𝐋 or an Amplitude or something different. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, and it is connected to the next question that I have for you. And it's related to how do you see a big organization's knowledge management tech ecosystem? Like, what are the tools, the software, the apps, or the practices that you see in a like really big organization? How does that look like? I mean, can Notion handle everything, or it has to be connected with other parts?
Yeah, let's be honest with each other. It's we can have how much time do you have? I could talk about this for
no,
10
we
minutes,
have,
but
yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So there's some studies out there. I'm sure everyone has seen them, especially if they're in DEI, or procurement, about companies, especially larger companies, using hundreds and hundreds of tools. I think I saw like the average company uses 250 SaaS tools, or maybe it's fewer than that. But and then on top of that, only half of the users that actually have access to those tools actually use them. Okay, so there's a tremendous amount of like value that is being lost in these tools. And I think it's really important if you procure tools on the procurement side or on the IT side, that you'll be really thoughtful about the tools that you're procuring. So I'll say this, like, okay, we've talked about a knowledge base today, for example, and internally that might look like an intranet for employees to access process-based documentation or product-based documentation. It might be an external help system that your end customers and clients are accessing to access some of that same documentation about your process and your products. That's just within knowledge base. We also, though, we see communication tools like Slack or Teams or, in the Google suite. They serve as like formal, but also informal channels for sharing knowledge with each other in written form. You also, though, have video conferencing tools like Zoom or Teams, Google Meet, or even StreamYard, like that can be used. So those are visual communication tools. You then have calendar and scheduling tools like Google Calendar, Calendly, Cron. We have issue tracking with Jira, tickets, Zendesk, etc. We have documentation and collaboration with docs, spreadsheets, presentations. I'll pause here for a second because that's just 6 categories. We have applicant tracking systems, Greenhouse, etc. Knowledge management within HR, Workday. You have project management tools, planning and organizational strategy like OKRs and KPIs. As you can see, like the ecosystem of tools is really big. And I'm sure I missed, and no offense to any tools out there if I missed your entire category. It's just to show that, like, when I sit down to have a conversation with a company, increasingly, especially in this environment, they're like, we have so much fragmentation and we have tools that solve one thing for us, a point solution for this one specific issue, because we wanted to find the best possible tool to solve for our issue tracking, for example. So we procured Jira, right? And a lot of times you'll find, especially at larger organizations, an emphasis around security, information security, cybersecurity, and risk and compliance. And so I find, at least when that's driving the evaluation and the discussion, you're going to find either internal solutions that a company has created for a particular use case. So you'll see a company that creates an intranet for their employees, for example, instead of procuring Notion, for example, for their company. Or you'll see they go for an incumbent solution who's been able to get all of those table stakes security features figured out, that checks all of those boxes for data warehousing in a particular geography. A lot of those things that come up. And so the tech ecosystem, to answer your question in one sentence, is very large. It's very fragmented. And it's diffuse. So it has a lot of different solutions that are solving, honestly, for one problem instead of solving for many problems.
Super interesting. Yeah. And it keeps growing. And there are even connectors right now as Zapier or related software to it. So the last question that I have for you, JM, is what are your thoughts and perspective in this field of knowledge management for the future, and specifically for 2023?
Yeah, very, very much on my mind as well, because we have a big opportunity in LATAM, and there's a short window to really capitalize on that opportunity because, as you mentioned, the space is very competitive. With incumbent solutions, but then also, it's the very real reality. A lot of these companies use a large solution like a Microsoft or a Google, and they're going to want to pull, within the existing suite of softwares that they use. So the one thing I'd say is knowledge management is never going to get less important from where I sit. So even as we move potentially in a future that is 2 or 5 years from now to back to office 5 days a week or 3 days a week, I don't know if I see that future necessarily, but it is a future that's already here for some companies that are in person with each other. But I've already seen in some of these larger companies an increased emphasis on learning and development. And those are leaders who seek a solution like Notion out, because that's obviously the most important thing is to enable that learning. There's also, I think, just with remote and hybrid work and asynchronous work and globally dispersed work, you have so many companies based in LATAM that are also working potentially with a developer team in Pakistan or in India, potentially with a customer support team in the Philippines, elsewhere, a team in the States, a team over in London, whatever it might be. Like asynchronous collaboration and the ability to work with each other, even when we are 12 hours apart, is super important. The big thing that's on my mind right now is that just given the economic environment, so it's, obviously very much on, I think, everyone's minds, the idea of recessions in different economies, currency devaluation, and the cost of all of these tools. There's going to be an emphasis on consolidating your tools so that they're not just solving for one thing. So I already see posts on LinkedIn about, winter is coming, and if you're solving for one use case, it's very much going to be a hard winter for everyone. But I think products that solve for more than one thing will still do very well. And I think tools that make integrations easy. So you mentioned Zapier earlier, Tray, for example, these tools that connect other systems, or products that emphasize integrations with other tools in your ecosystem, will be much, much more attractive, and you'd be willing to pay a premium for having those tools that make connections easier. So those are some of my thoughts. I'd love to hear, kind of your take on it as well, like within the business ecosystem at Continuum. Like, what's your take on this perspective that I have? Do you see that play out?
Sure. I really get what you're saying. And for us, I mean, every time I see Notion, there are many pages, new pages that we put into the space. So what I believe right now is, how do we arrange that information? How do we, maybe we can have analytics in the future about that information that we have at Notion. It would be super useful for us, for example. And as it keeps growing, how do you connect that with, for example, other related tools? For us as a tech company, it's really easier because Notion is like a playground. You can create a website, you can create a CMS or a CRM. Yeah, you can create many different types of apps inside them, as you told yourself, even learning platforms. We have used it at Continuum, learning platforms using Notion. So it has been amazing. And I think the most important thing is that how we can arrange all that information that is going to be left out or deprecated. And besides that, how can we use data from the information that we have there? Because it's going to keep growing in the future. And for us, it's really important to don't have deprecated information, because, for example, our whole onboarding process is in Notion. Maybe some card that we have there is deprecated or is not updated. So how can we know that it's not updated at the moment? And I think that happens with many information. I mean, people that is developing product, insights from user, for example, people that use it as a user's database, or insights from users from product. How can you know that information is updated or not? So, I mean, those main topics for us are really important in the future. And as I believe the tools that Notion gives us are going to help us noticing that in the future. And something that I didn't tell you is that really interesting. It might sound as funny to you, but one of our division is dedicated to employment and learning. So we help companies in solving tech problems that are also connected with talent development, learning, human resources, and related. So and we have worked also with universities. So once we even created a course of how to use Notion. And we have done that with companies. So like short courses. So it's interesting the potential that it has as like right now many people. And that's what he was asking in the beginning. Do you have a playbook? Because that information is so useful to people. People that can use this tool can accelerate their results. I mean, can have more productivity. And it's easier for them to use Notion instead of other like large products right now, if you are a little bit tech savvy, you know? So
yeah,
those are,
it's like,
yeah.
that's it. Those are all, like you said, so much good stuff there. For me personally, but I think also for the group, it's like this catch-22 that any knowledge management solution, whether it's a Notion or something else, is going to run into. It's like, there's this saying that we have in English that, especially at startups, you are building the plane while you fly it. So you're literally flying the plane into the air and you're putting the wings on back here and the tail and the rudder and all of those things. And I think it's so true that, you know, at a larger company, for example, the idea of content staleness, for example, we call that staleness, where you have a card that might be out of date, you know, or enforcing who actually owns that content, you know? So if I'm an administrator of a workspace that has 3 or 5 or 10,000 people within it, being able to know, okay, it looks like, you know, this card or this page or this block hasn't been updated in 2.5 years. Like, let's go through periodically. And there are people whose full-time job it is to manage their instance of Notion. You know, and I think the one thing maybe we didn't talk about, but you brought up just now, is that knowledge management tools pay for themselves because they ramp your new hires so much faster into your organization when you have a really well-documented process and onboarding process for them. So like, I'll give you an example. Like when somebody onboards, you know, and has a ramp period that might normally take 3 months at a small company or a large one, if you can get that process to be 2 months, especially if turnover goes up, you're saving so much by making them a productive and contributing employee so much faster.
Yeah, and that's like one of the key aspects in terms of knowledge management. I mean, if you have the right tools and if you have the right culture, like the amount of money you can save and the cost that you can save in large organizations is huge. I mean, one of the problems that we see over and over in large organizations is what happens when like people that have been for 10, 15 years in the company, they leave. And all of I mean, you can't leave their brain in the company, you know?
Right,
so
right.
That information is so valuable for the company, and it will shorten the amount of time that people is productive. So, I mean, when you connect technology with knowledge management and the right tools and the right culture, I mean, miracles can happen. And that is like what we aim to.
Yeah, of course. And it sounds like in your work, you're connecting and evangelizing that message to other people. It can be hard to figure out what value that is to a company, you know? So if I'm sitting and, you know, I'm responsible for the tooling budget, the software budget for a large company, and I have 250 tools that are competing for that budget. You know, if we have 250 software as a service companies that we work with, knowledge management can be difficult to put a value on, just because it can be difficult to measure that productivity and that efficiency and that time to ramp. But that is very much an emphasis on what we try to do. And I'm happy you're helping share that message with companies to say, you know, it has this one very real impact of getting your companies ready to, your employees, ready to contribute from much earlier. But then it also makes people much more bought into the narrative when they see transparency and visibility. I feel much more inclined to contribute to the mission of the company if I know what that mission is. And I see that mission actually play out in the documentation that I interact with every day.
Exactly, yeah. And what I was thinking about related to what you were saying is that as you move into a more asynchronous way of working, you need documentation, because people from different parts of the world in different time zones are going to be needing that information. And there are like many processes that you can like improve and make more efficient if you have that documentation. I mean, career lines, onboarding, offboarding, like learning platforms, learning content. So there is an infinite like possibilities when you can document that, and when you can bring the culture that is the hardest part at the beginning, for of course from even more in traditional companies, the culture of documentation. So I think that's still a challenge, but when you have easier tools, like in the right tools, everything gets easier.
Sebastian, I don't want to hijack the agenda, but I have a question for you,
Okay.
being based in LATAM. And maybe it would be interesting, a discussion question for the community as well, and maybe not. And we'll just have this one question from me at least. But I find, so it's a US based company, and we're working with LATAM. And one of the things I love the absolute most out of clients in LATAM is that they are getting as much value as they can out of the software. Every possible use case under the sun, they're going to find it, and so it actually makes it a lot more joyful to work with clients in LATAM. But just your perspective on how, like, US-based companies that are trying to get into LATAM, I'm just be curious about your perspective on how they can do that successfully. This is just me being selfish and curious about your perspective.
Yeah. Also, there's another chapter we can do on that, but I think there are many different realities. I mean, LATAM is so diverse. I mean, even if you go to one city to another, the way of speaking is different. So take that into the organizational culture. We are right now in Chile, Peru, Colombia, and we have people all over Latin America. And the culture is so rich and diverse that the approach that you have to take for Chile or for Peru or Argentina is different. I mean, it's not like one size fits all. So I think that it's so important, because the difference between each country and in the economics, the language, the culture, the diplomacy that you have to take with is different. And of course, the reality of, in terms of like, how can you like find like profitable clients, you will have to differentiate the cost that the price that you give to each country, because their realities are so different. I mean, think about Argentina, Venezuela, from Chile or Colombia, for example. There are many different stages in the maturity, and also the tech maturity of each country is different. I mean, if you see the investment possibilities, for example, for startups in Chile, Argentina, or taking out Brazil out of the picture, because it's a whole different reality. I mean, yeah. So I think it's like understanding the culture of the business culture that you have to go with. And that's if you go to traditional companies. But if you go approach like if you want to get close to tech teams, the culture tends to standardize. I mean, technology in general, Latin America tends to like standardize the culture, the way of working, it's the language, but that's only a portion of each companies,
Of course.
It's different. So I think that's like one quick view that I can give you.
No, I super appreciate that. And getting back to kind of the core of what we're talking about, so many larger companies, but even startups, have offices in multiple countries. And so you're navigating different. How have you seen that play out in terms of related to knowledge management specifically? Like you mentioned, presence in Chile, in Peru, in Colombia, hopefully in more countries in the future as well, for Continuum. like, how have you seen that play out, and how can knowledge management maybe contribute to standardizing even across cultures and across borders within LATAM?
Yeah, I think one perspective that I have on that, I can compare it with the problems that we've had on how to pay people all around like different countries in Latin America. I mean, if we could like organize that, standardize that, it would be huge. And what I'm mentioning that because right now it's hard like to pay people from different countries and have the same benefits that you have for everyone. And that it's related to information and documentation, because the practices that you have in, for example, using Notion or similar tools are easier right now, you know. And if you have every type of information segmented from cultures, we even have like a language dictionary for different cultures. I mean, how do you say one word? Like a party in Colombia and Chile and Argentina has a different name. So getting back to the question, yeah, there are many opportunities that you can have, like standardizing information and understanding that even though there are different cultures, you can have like same processes. And I think, at least in what we are trying to achieve, we are trying to like elevate the standard of what we can give to the people that work with us in order to have an even more, I mean, better benefits and better improvements at everything. I mean, leveling up to the best country. I mean, if, for example, Chile has like greater like salaries, I mean, how do we move into that? Or if we have benefits, how do we move into that? So I think that's a challenge that we have right now at every company that is working with different countries, because right now the problem that we have is that companies from the US or Europe are hiring people from here, and they can like improve their benefits like twice or 10 times. So it's an interesting scenario that we're confronting right now, and even more, of course, in the tech environment.
Definitely. I appreciate that perspective a lot.
Okay, GM, we're almost at time, so I really appreciate your participation here. I hope we can keep talking and see what's next in Notion when you have that information. I hope you keep growing. Can we on our help with that here in Latin America, at least with the clients that we have. So it was amazing having you here.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Gracias, Sebastián, y a todos por escuchar.
Okay, JM. Take care and bye. See you soon.
Ciao. We'll see ya.